Hello and welcome to Piwik PRO YouTube video series. Topic of the video: how to create audiences in Piwik PRO customer data platform. So, what we're gonna learn? We'll start by explaining what is an audience in Piwik PRO CDP and briefly touch on its role. Then we'll dive into the details of how to create an audience, including the types of data you can use, such as attributes and events, and their sources. This will give us a sense of the data that can be integrated beyond just the website interactions. Next, we'll explore how to create conditions based on attribute values, their frequency, and recency. Okay, let's dive in. First question is, what is an audience? Audience is a group of visitors and/or users who share common attributes or behaviors. Now, let's unpack that definition. Let's break down this definition to make clear what audience is and what it isn't. So when we're talking about visitors, we refer mainly to the context of a website. And when we're talking about users, we could be talking about wider context, cross-platform context. So for example, the context of a mobile app, website, CRM platform, email automation platform, and so on. As long as we use common identifier between those platforms, email, phone number, or customer ID, so that we merge and reach data from across platforms to have one profile representing data for that very user from across those platforms. And then the user will belong to a certain audience if they meet the audience criteria, or should I say audience conditions. Also, even if we are only within the context of a website, if we're still using those common identifiers, we could be talking about the users too, because even though we might be using only or talking only about the context of a website, there's still possibility of using such audience across platforms. And then there's a share common attributes or behaviors part. Let's start with the attribute. The attribute is a description of audience users, their common characteristics like device they used when they visited the website, email subscription status, subscribed or unsubscribed, or date of birth. Attributes can be mutable or immutable. In other words, they can change across time. So for example, channel by which visitor accessed our website, it can change. Or they can be static, like date of birth. If attributes change across time, sometimes data change can be very relevant to us, like email subscription. If the user changed their status from subscribe to unsubscribe, it may block certain activities. Or when values of the attribute change across time, we could be recording these values as a list instead of updating them like with email subscription. So for example, values of the device type could be a list, and if that's the case, we could be storing each device value in a list and then use it for audience creation purposes. We're gonna expand on the attributes later, but our definition mentions also behavior, which could be described as a number of specific interactions on the website in a span of certain time. In that sense, the behavioral data would come primarily from the website. Again, we're going to expand on that in a moment, but we are left with one question. What are the audiences used for? We're going to use them for activations in an automated process of utilizing data to trigger actions and updates across various channels and platforms. This includes customizing content on a website, syncing or updating data to ensure consistency across systems, or triggering workflows like sending emails, displaying ads, or sending notifications. Activation ensures that data is not just stored, but actively used to enhance customer experiences and drive business processes. Now, before we start creating new audiences and cover all different aspects of audience creation or audience conditions, there are a few things I need to cover, which are sort of like a foundation for that next part. So at the moment of the recording of the video, audiences start collecting profile data after they're created or edited. So here I have the existing audience and it already has a one profile. Now, if I were to edit this audience and change the conditions, say, let's do 2 times, and not only do I get this warning message, I will see that all profiles are gone. That would be true even if the profile, after changing the conditions, would still meet the criteria. It's basically what it basically means. Any edits or creation of new audiences collects data not retrospectively, but from the moment of the edit and the moment of creating and saving the audience. Another important thing is that we can enrich user profiles by importing data from external tools, external platforms like CRMs, support platforms, email marketing tools, and so on. So that way our profiles can be more comprehensive. Another thing is that CDP uses the same database as analytics, but there are certain dimensions that cannot be used in CDP because CDP uses live data for quick activations, live activations, whereas analytics uses mostly process data for data analysis. So analytics waits for the session, i.e. visit, to finish. That's why dimensions such as pages in session or session time, those values are accessible in the analytics, but not in CDP. Which brings me to another important piece of information, and that is that in CDP there is no concept of session. Again, because we use live data. Instead, we should be thinking about user profile, and that while the visit goes by, the profile is being updated with the new data points, so-called attributes, and behavioral data based on the condition of the audience. The best thing about it is that your profile could be updated not only based on the website visit, but also based on the other profile interactions, and it also happens live. So for example, the user could be using the desktop while confirming their email using mobile at the same time. So the profile is being updated based on not only interactions on the desktop, but also on a mobile and perhaps even email automation tools. So we have a full spectrum of a cross-platform behavior and not limited to the website context. Okay, so let's start playing with audience creation. And you normally would start creating audience while having a specific activation or activations in mind, because you could use one audience for multiple activations. Sort of like with Tag Manager. So you would create a tag and you would attach a trigger to a tag. So similarly, you would have that with audience and activation. But today, I just want to cover audience creation without any specific activation in mind and focus more on possibilities and mechanisms. So I'm not going to create any activation. So let's click on Add an Audience. And in here, you have this intermediate window. So you have some suggested audience. You can think about them as templates. So definitely check those. You have existing audiences. So if you want to copy the existing audience and let's say play with it further to add some additional conditions or remove some of the conditions and just adjust it for your specific needs, you could do that. Or if you want to copy segment, so we have segment is a filter in the analytics, and if you want to take advantage of that, you can do that too. But I'm just going to click on create a custom audience. I'm just going to create audience tree. I'm going to leave the description as it is. First, let's explain what is a membership duration. So user can join the audience if they meet the criteria, if they meet the conditions of the audience. They can also leave this audience if they no longer meet those conditions, no longer meet those criteria. And that's one way of leaving the audience. Another way of leaving the audience after previously joining the audience is through membership duration. So if the user joins the audience but then is inactive for longer than 30 days, then user will be removed from that audience. In other words, membership duration is the number of days a user stays in the audience without any activity. If there's no activity, meaning no updates to their profile, either from a website activity or data imports, so any updates from external systems that are basically syncing data with CDP, will count as an activity. But if there's no such activity, so no activity on a website and no activity via external data imports, the user will be removed from the audience. And any updates in between those 30 days would restart this membership duration back to 0. So we would start the counter from the very first day and count again up until 30 days. 30 days is the default, what we set the audience for. But that number can be increased or decreased, and we can increase it up to 540 days. Now let's see what sort of attributes we can use, and let's start with the ones you might be familiar with when using the analytics. So first one would be, let's use campaign name. Campaign name is basically a dimension in the analytics that captures the values of the campaigns from which visitor arrived to when accessing the website. Campaign name is also a UTM parameter. So if you use UTM parameters and if you use campaign name parameter, that will be the value of that very parameter. And when we're talking about the analytics, the value, there's only one value, and it's being assigned to a particular visit, particular session. But when we're talking about the profile, like in case of a CDP, there might be several values. So visitor might be arriving from some sort of email campaign on one occasion, on another occasion from Google Ads, and then from email again. In here, so we have three values. We would have three values. In here, we have this first and last. So we can use either first, we can select in these conditions to use first value or the last value. So let's say I want to use the last value. And let's say the campaign is email. Just to simplify, let's say that's the name of our campaign. So let's save it. But what if I want to have access not only to last and the first value, but to, let's say, all values? No problem. We can go to attributes, and from the very attribute called campaign name, which is a string, meaning it's not a number, it's the value is a combination of letters and numbers. In here we have aggregation, that's how we call it, first and last. Now, if I were to create a new one from this very built-in attribute, I could change the aggregation. So we could change it to first, maybe not for the campaign name, but there could be some attributes where first value would be more important than only important, and that's the only one we want to store, or the last value as opposed to first and a last. We could leave it as it is, first and last, but that would be a duplication. And then we have a list and list unique. So list means that we would store each and every value. List unique, we would avoid using repetitive values. So if the visitor comes from email, then Google Ads, then email. In the list, we would have three values: email, Google Ads, and email. In a list unique, we would have email and Google Ads. So let's use list unique and let's save it. Let's just change the name to a list. And now let's save it. So you can see that it is now our custom attribute. And let's go back to our audience and let's edit it. I'm gonna remove that. Campaign list. And notice that now not only I can use first and the last value, but I can use any value. And let's say I can write email. So if any value, or meaning any, in other words, any touch point through which a visitor, campaign touch point, that is an email, we're going to include that very profile, that very visitor in our audience. So whether it's a first, last, or any in between the first and the last, whenever that campaign is an email, we're going to include that very profile in our audience. Let's use one more attribute that you might be familiar with from when you used analytics. And this time I'm going to use device type. Now notice I can drag and drop it under or and an area. So if I were to drop it here, what it would mean, well, let's first choose the value. So I'm going to choose the value and let's say it's smartphone. So what it means when I choose on the to drag and drop it under add, it means that both conditions would need to be met. So email campaign, any campaign would have to be email, and device type, first device type would have to be a smartphone. Obviously I can change that first to last. We covered that when we were talking about campaign name. But in here, notice that we also have this drop-down menu where I can choose select particular value. So the difference between a string as a value for the attribute contains different condition: is not, contains, does not, contains, etc. You can use regular expressions, etc. Especially useful for when we have any. But in here, because we have a drop-down menu, we can use is or is not. So that's a distinction that it's worthwhile knowing. Now, if I were to drag and drop it under here, now it would be or regular operator. Now, it may not make sense for this particular use case, but let's say if I were to add it like that and change it to Google Ads. So that way the condition says include profile of which visitor comes from a campaign that is email or campaign that is Google Ads at any point throughout their visit on the website. So at any visit. And then here, device type. First device type is smartphone or perhaps a desktop, if I were to add it like that. So we can see how we can play with this or and logical operators and arrive at the appropriate condition for our audience. Now, apart from built-in dimensions that we get with the analytics too, any custom dimensions will be available in here as well. So we have access to all different custom dimensions. Now, any custom dimension that is session scope custom dimension will be an attribute, and any event scope custom dimension will be event dimension. We'll get to event dimensions in just a moment. Moreover, we have seen custom attributes and how we can convert built-in attributes into custom attribute when we want to change the aggregation. So we did that with the campaign name. We changed the aggregation to a unique list, and that's why we have campaign name as a list. However, we could obviously create custom attributes that are coming from other platforms. We would just need to first create an attribute. So from here, we would need to create an attribute, create a type, whether it's a number, string, IP, Boolean, date, time, things like that. And then select the aggregation and follow that process. We're gonna record another video on that topic. And then we would be able to import data. So import data using webhooks. And then that way we could sync data between platforms to then use them in the audiences. So later, once we would do that, we would be able to access those attributes via custom attributes. So things like, let's say, gender, email opens count, things like that. So there are a variety of options that we would be able to pursue in here. So let's take an example of the email opens count. We would need to drag and drop it here. Email opens count, which is a custom attribute that was imported in this case from the email automation platform. So we've used this automation platform to manage emails, and that platform could potentially also count the number of emails that were opened by the user. By syncing that data with our CDP, we now can use it to create an audience of users that tend to open emails from us. And in here we have the counter. Obviously, this condition can be combined with other powerful conditions, not only from email automation platform, but from other platforms as well. What is also important here is that email opens count provides us with a number. So even though it's an attribute, it gives us the number, as opposed to providing us with the string. And notice that when we use a string, we can have first, last, or any value. So we might collect several values, but in here it's a number. So it increments every time when a user opens an email from us. So that's why we don't have this condition here. However, another thing that is different is that conditions for a string are as follows: is not, contains, does not contain. Whereas for a number, it is equals, not equals, is greater than, is less than, and so on. So we could create a condition like is greater than 6, which would mean that we would create an audience of users that have opened the email from us more than 6 times, which indicates some sort of interest in our emails. There are 2 more things that I would like to expand on in relation to attributes before we get to event dimension. And those are 2 sections: users and user identifiers. Let's start with the user identifiers. So visitor ID and cookie ID are 2 identifiers that are used out of the box by the analytics, and we could use their values as conditions. There are probably not that many use cases for it, but that is not the case for user ID, which could be, say, email. User ID is a custom identifier in analytics, but once we use it, it becomes available in CDP just like custom dimensions. The potential of user ID is that it can be used to sync data across platforms for a user if we have a match between those platforms. If, for example, email used on the website matches the email that we have in, say, email automation platform like MailChimp. I keep using MailChimp because this is the one that we have here, a use case for that. So this is the data import example. We have a webhook, and in here we have incoming key. So that's the data that we are sending from MailChimp, and we are matching it with our user ID, which is an email. We know it's an email, but that could be other value like customer ID, etc., etc. So this means we can sync data not only with via email, but other sort of means. And then we select sort of, in here we could potentially select additional data that we want to upload to our CDP. That's just the example. And now how would we use such identifiers in the audience conditions? Now I'm going to skip visitor ID and cookie ID because those would be rarely used, and I'm going to use user ID. First of all, we might have a visitor that accesses our website using one email or multiple emails. If the visitor ID is the same, well, we could grab first, last, or any value of the email. So that's one thing. Another thing is that at the moment of while we're creating an audience, we may not know the email of the user. And quite frequently, we would not create an audience for specific users, but for users of which user ID we do have. How do we create a condition? Well, we could do something like this. So if we have the attribute any user ID is not empty, so we leave that space empty and we use is not. That means that we do have value for user ID for a particular user. And that's how we can basically create audiences for users that we can identify across platforms. Now let's go back to the user section in which we can use specific attributes that are giving us possibility to create condition based on recent activity. So let's take an example of last activity time in the last, say, 7 days. So that way, not only those conditions at the top have to be met. Last activity time is in the last 7 days. Now, what do we count by activity? Activity is any update to any of the attributes or any activity on the website or any updates to the attributes. This includes not only attributes that we collect from the website or an app, but also from external sort of systems. Like, for example, email open counts has changed. That would count as an activity, regardless of this particular condition. If that particular attribute was updated from 1 to 2 or to 3 to 4 or from 7 to 8, that would be counted as an activity. Obviously, user would need to meet the criteria of this particular attribute to join that particular audience, this particular audience that we've created here. So that's last activity time. Similar would be to first activity time. So based on the fact that the visitor became a user in CDP in recent, let's say, 7 days. So it's not an old-time user, but the recent new user, or based on last visited page URL is or contains or is not XYZ, let's say. So we can play with those as well using those kind of attributes. So again, we can play with the activity, recency of the activity, and we can talk about the activity in general, or specific activity like page URL, or specific activity like last order time, last activity time. Moreover, not only do I in the context of activity time, not only can I use relative time before last, in the last 7 days, in the next 7 days, after the next 7 days, etc. I can also use absolute time, so later than, say, particular date, right? So we don't want to count the activity from before we started some sort of campaign, only after we started the campaign, let's say some sort of event, to not get the overlap of two different audiences, let's say. So that's another example of this time absolute condition as opposed to relative condition. Now let's move on to event dimensions. I started with a new audience 4, so I have more space to create conditions. Event dimensions are interactions that are tracked on the website or app via Piwik PRO platform. This includes out-of-the-box events like page views, as well as customized events like Go conversions or custom events. Moreover, and this is when they actually become very powerful, you can decide on their frequency and recency. The great benefit of that is that thanks to frequency, you can create conditions that could indicate the level of interest or say disinterest. And thanks to recency conditions, you can create audiences that are fresh and not say out of date and as a result irrelevant. So let's create a few examples of event dimensions and their conditions for our audience. First, let's explain event type. Event type allows us to select the type of event, type of interaction that we want to refer to when creating the condition. So that could be page view, outlink, download, search, custom event, and so on. And in here, we can select the frequency of the event. So at least, let's say 3 times. And moving further, we can here select the recency. So those 3 page views would have to happen in the last minute for the user to join the audience, or 3 minutes or 4 minutes. So that gives us the recency, but we can go as high as few days, or say 10 days or 20 days or 30 days or 100 days. As long as a visitor performed those events in that period of time, they would join the audience. So that's why we have this recency. So frequency can give us the level of interest, the recency, the freshness of the very audience. Now, when selecting event type as the only condition in here, we're only focusing on an event, on the interaction. So just page views, any page views. But we could be more specific. We could potentially add page URL, which is sort of like a parameter to a page view event, but not only page view event, and specified what sort of 3 page views we are after. So we could be very specific. So let's say we could specify that visitor has to go to the loans page. So this page on our website 3 times in the last 3 days, and then they would join the audience. Again, those 3 pages would have to happen within the window of 3 days, not necessarily in the same day, but across 3 days, or perhaps within the same minute, but that would still meet the criteria of 3 days. Now, another thing, we could change it to say contains, because we have different conditions here. And let's say select the blog. So if the URL contains the blog bit, we could also count the 3 pages. So whether it's this blog post or let's say this blog post, we would still meet the criteria. So that would be another page view, and let's say this page URL, that's still blog. So someone interested in our blog content. Now on our blog posts, we have blog post category. So I could copy this category. In this case, I wouldn't use page URLs, but I would use the custom dimension that we use in the analytics, and I would use the blog post category is insurances, right? So only if a blog post has a category insurances, we would count the event. So 3 the same blog posts so that could be visits to this particular blog post or any other blog post, as long as the blog post category is insurances, right? So that could be another way of using the page view as an event type. Now we could use event type with other event types, obviously. So for example, download event type. But in this case, we wouldn't use blog category because blog category custom dimension is not within the scope of download event type. So we can't use blog category for this case. In this case, we would have to use download URL, where event type specifies the type of event, which is a download, and download URL specifies the URL of the downloaded file. So we can be very specific using is, and then here we would have to provide the address, URL address of the file, or be less specific and let's say just add .csv, and that would mean that we wouldn't count downloads for PDF files, but only for CSV files. So any CSV file that was downloaded at least 3 times in the last 3 days would cause the user to join that particular audience, right? Now, but if you think about it, because download URL is specific enough to narrow down the type of event, which is a download, we don't necessarily need to use event type is download. We can remove it and that would work the same, because download URL is not the context for any other event other than download event. Now, this is not true for page URL event. And this is why whenever we use page URL, we automatically drag and drop event type is pageview. But we would use pageview only if we want to refer to pageview events. What do I mean by that? What do I mean that page URL can be a context for any type of event? If we think about it, not all, but many different types of events. If I were to consider scroll event, now I scrolled, I could track the scrolls using custom events, and it happens on a specific URL. If I were to scroll on this page, the URL is different. So page URL not necessarily refers to page event. It can describe other events as well. So let's take an example of a click, which is a custom event that custom event can be captured by using 4 parameters: category, custom event action, custom event name, custom event value. But in our case, in case of this website, custom event name captures the text of a button that we have here. So in this case, it's your get your estimate here. In case of this button, is a logout. In case of this button, it's get in touch with exclamation mark, right? So if I were to, let's say, count the number of times, say at least 3 times in the last, say, 2 days, and the custom event is, let's say, get in touch, and that would mean that anybody who clicked on a get in touch button at least 2 times in the last 2 days would join the audience of audience 4 in our case. However, get in touch button exists not only on the loans page, but it exists on every blog post. So this blog post has a get in touch button. If I were to go to any other blog post, it also has this get in touch button. So if I want to specify to the loans page button clicks, I can use page URL. I need to, in this case, remove event type as a pageview and copy the loans URL. In this case, it provides the background for the custom event type, being more specific, when the custom event name is get in touch, which is a name of a button. So visitor user would have to click at least 2 times on get in touch button on this particular URL in the last 2 days, and that would be the condition for this audience. Now, just because I've used event dimensions and I didn't use attributes in the conditions of this audience, doesn't mean that we cannot use these sort of conditions here. So I could potentially add, say, channel is a campaign, and let's say last channel is a campaign, and that would mean that any visitor who clicked on the get in touch button at least 2 times in the last 2 days on the loans page, and the last value for that particular user channel was a campaign, so they came via campaign on their last visit, not necessarily any of the visit when they clicked on those 2 twice on the button get in touch, but may as well be that very visit. This would mean that they would join the audience. So what I'm trying to say is that you can use attributes and event dimensions together to get even more powerful, more specific audience conditions for your activations. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking it and subscribing to our channel. Check the description below to find some useful links like free Piwik PRO sign up page, community forum page, and links to related videos. Until next time.